Welcome to all of you. Another thanks. Thank you all for coming. And I hope all of you had a chance maybe to see the exhibitions last night. If you didn't yet, I'm here to remind you that they are magical. And that's a word I might use a few times today. It's been on my mind a bit. I really appreciate the invitation to be on stage with these two fantastic artists. It's been great the past couple of days getting to spend time with their work. I actually had the privilege of co-curating Erin Shirreff's first kind of larger museum exhibition, also with ICA Boston, and that was in 2016, which is 8 years ago, and I can't believe it. And I had the privilege of adding 4 works of hers to our museum's permanent collection in Buffalo, and then thanks to Louis Grouchos, who was formerly the director at the Buffalo AKG, which was then the Albright Knox, we have 14 works of Arturo's in the collection. Both of these groups included gifts from one of our patrons, Deborah Ronan, to whom I'm also very grateful. So I've been lucky to spend time with these artists, and I'm just thrilled to see you all today. Thank you. Arturo, I'm going to start with you. Sure. So I have, just actually preamble, I should do setting of stage. I have a few questions for the artists, and then there's time for you to have questions afterwards. I think we're going to talk for about 35, 40 minutes, and then probably about 15 minutes for audience questions. We started a touch late, so we might go a little past 3. Arturo, when we talked about, we're starting with Erin's slides, so these will cycle through and then we'll see your show. But when we were talking about the planning, you were sort of here in Santa Fe already, and we had a chat, and I said, how's it been going? And you said, it's kind of like a pinball game. It's a little bit like a pinball machine. Right. Can you explain that?
Well, I mean, it's such a incredible opportunity to have a show here in this space that from the outside looks like a very small, tiny place, and when you enter, it's just incredibly grand and very generous. I think for artists, this SITESANTAFE is a perfect place to show because the spaces are conducive to looking at the art in the correct way with the right lighting. So the presentation that I did this time is basically all works and new works all combined together so the audience is able to move from one point to the other without me telling them exactly how to do it. So you will have favorite pieces, or you will go start from the back or from the front, but it doesn't matter because I'm interested in the choreography of the viewer dictating how they go from one place to the other. So it's fascinating that I saw people yesterday going back and forth and returning to the pieces. That's exactly what I wanted. So
I mean, I had this, the works go from 92 to like 2022 or something like that. Yeah. And I also had the same experience. I kept on thinking I'd found another room because I'd left one and then realized I hadn't seen something on one wall. No, it really requires a lot of time. And I think it's interesting how your work has changed a lot over the years. But this show creates a sense of, I think, really diversity, but also cohesion. It's really interesting.
Yeah, if you spend time with a show, which requires a lot of, I will say, taking your time and looking at how layers are glued together. Nothing is done digitally, nothing is done photographically in a sense of collages. So you have to look at the fragments, the layers, and then you'll be able to see things that repeat and reappear and images that are recycled through time from the 90s up to now. So,
thank you. Yeah, we'll all pinball through it, hopefully over time. Erin, I think not everybody knows that you have a history here at Site Santa Fe, a good history, not a bad one. So well, I wondered if you could talk a little about your time at Site. I know you worked on a biennial. Yeah, could you talk about it?
For sure. And I guess I came here at the end of the 90s with my artist boyfriend at the time, who's still here. We're still good friends. Even though he brought me to this strange, magical place of New Mexico. I am Canadian, but I was from Canada. So it was sort of a 3-part dislocation when I got here. There was the Americanness of it all, the Santa Fe-ness of it all. And then for me, working here, which I was lucky enough to do, was just this complete immersion into contemporary art in a way that I hadn't up until that point had, because I had studied art in Canada, I came here as a baby, really. And so this museum and the ambitious programming that Louis Grouchos was doing at the time really formed me. I really agree with Arturo, who says this is sort of this perfect place to show work. And I realize I'm so pleased with how the exhibition came together here. And I think it's because this place has haunted me for all of these years. And I think the work that I made was always with the aspiration of showing it in a space like this.
Oh, wow.
This is a beer warehouse. It's very fancy now, but it was very much a beer warehouse when I was here, and but the walls and the floor, the beautiful screwed up floors, and the scale of it was something that really imprinted on me. So, I've said to the publication, the press people are like, we really want to mention how you're from Santa Fe, and I'm like, well, I don't want to feel like it's this nepotistic show, and I was like, because I do feel, this is really flaky, but I kind of feel like a baby of this museum a little bit. So it is a little bit.
I love this. This is like a homecoming.
Yeah, I know.
Well, what kind of work did you do here? What was your...
The job that I did
what was
here?
your job?
I was a Girl Friday for various demanding men. It's true. One of them. But I think the project that most, I guess, was probably the biggest deal when I was here was Dave Hickey's biennial. And so I was actually, had one foot out the door, and Louis sort of convinced me that this big Texas man should be my boss for 2 years. And I agreed, and he really made a big impression on me in lots of ways. And we kept in touch all the way till his death, actually. But that show was enormously ambitious, and I think we pulled it off. Yeah, you guys remember it? Yeah.
But I will say, like, working with you, even these 8 years ago, you had a really good sense of how to put an installation together already. And you'd done gallery shows too, of course. But I do think time here taught you a lot about stagecraft and scenography. And
it's sort of a blessing and a curse. I'm sure, Arturo, you have such a long exhibition history. You have this as well. But from knowing about shipping and all that stuff, I mean, yeah, all the nuts and bolts.
So looking at these shows, I was struck, as I think probably many of us were, at the kind of, many of us are when we look at art that uses ready-made elements or uses found materials, by the kind of alchemy that takes place in artists' hands between the source material and then the work's final result that we see in the galleries. Both of you, and these shows are really, really different, but there are some, I think, connections or ways that they can be tied or I think related to each other. Both of you draw on modernist painting and sculpture, of course, but also you draw on source material that's kind of otherwise banal, otherwise just could have been thrown away from our recent past. And with Erin, it's kind of the more recent colored digital collage works like Midday, Dilemma. They're sourced from books, but they've become so abstract you really can't recognize the source material. We just kind of recognize something about their age based on the printing technique and the quality of the palette, I think, that those books were generated from. And then with Arturo, your source material ranges from the from comic books to coloring books and earlier works. And then in some of the more recent works, you have images drawn from ballet, from choreography, in a work like Studies for Dance, which I just loved seeing last night. In your work, the source materials may be a little bit more easy to grasp because the fragments are more recognizable. To me, it seems you're really drawn to gestures. And I was wondering, you don't have to agree with that, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you gather the materials that you incorporate into your works, and perhaps how the contents of those have shifted over time.
Right. Well, I started working in New York in very difficult economic situation. So I worked in a small kitchen, and the only sources I had was Salvation Army books, and so I collected magazines, books, and one of my favorite things to buy was coloring books already colored in, and the kids don't like those, and they don't like to get coloring books that somebody else did. So I will get all of those for, 20 of those for $1. And I realized that after cutting, comics, or probably mostly I was attracted to Disney, the animators, if you cut an arm or a leg or a head, it becomes immediately biomorphic abstraction. So this John Arp and Max Ernst, there's all these languages there. And I thought, but if I combine it in different ways, then it will create something new. So that was basically a very simple revelation. And I thought, well, how can two pieces of paper or several create some kind of experience for the audience? So I explored that up to 2005 in different ways, combining drawings and original sources, manipulating that into abstraction. And then around 2006, with the works that opened the exhibition here, it shifted into a much more abstract, painterly, I will say wet, pouring, cutting, a much more complicated way of contaminating those sources. So he has gone through this, I will say, comic, much simpler language into a much more complicated thing. And what I want to do is that I think everybody, I mean, the work is still made out of layers and fragments, and I want people to investigate a little bit more time to see if they could get a sense of grasping something in the collage or in the sculpture or in the felt piece, to be able to enter it and then explore from there. So.
Right. I mean, and by using recognizable material, each one of these is a kind of pathway in. You know,
Exactly,
like this is
right.
medieval
Right.
sculpture fragment
Exactly.
here on the, yeah.
I think, the viewer will start with the left corner or on the bottom, and from there, hopefully we'll create some kind of journey inside in this very intimate image. And if it goes to the wall paintings, then it's a complete monumental kind of experience. So I like to play both of them. Some collages are made up with one piece of paper, and the other ones with hundreds of pieces of paper. So, but the intention is the same.
Do you have any sense today in the way that, like, so you talked about the kind of what drew you to the comic and that kind of recent past that was drawing you, and now I think your historical breadth is sort of broader in the newspaper fragments you might use. Do you have any sense right now of what's calling to you, or like what you're incorporating?
No, I get all kinds of sources, because I think all of them provide some kind of information. So I have a certain tendency to pick, dancers or choreography or theater or opera stages, but I think all of fragments give you a hint into how you could manipulate your journey through the piece. So hopefully the fragments and the layers will create a dialogue with the audience. So.
Yeah, I'm gonna come back to Erin and talk about source material too. But since you mentioned the fragment, which of course we can't escape, I'd love to stay on that subject with you a little bit. I've been thinking about the way, to me, you seem to channel this aspect of the human experience, is that our lives are entirely fragmentary. I mean, none of us are the same person from one day to the next. Continuity of a single individual moving through life is this illusion that we create. But we have a strong, I think, human desire to tell stories that create coherence, that create logic out of what is really discontinuous, these like irrational events that happen to us in life. And I wondered if you could talk about how you relate to that coherence a little bit, because we're talking about the way the fragments create a way into for people. When does something cohere for you?
Well, I think, like you said, our lives are fragmented. It's basically based on bits of memory that we just create some kind of connection. And by providing these images for the audience for this temporary time to May 27, what I want is to give you a kind of a point of entry to be able to see if it makes sense to you at this time while you're here, to make sense of these pieces of fragments that we all have connections to, either comics, we have memories of that, or photography, or newspaper cuttings, or a drip, or a color. So there's so many elements that we could enter, and each of us is different from that. And hopefully that will give you a point of entry into the work, and you spend more time on it. So I'm fascinated by fragments because we are just fragmented. So and through fragments, we make sense of our lives. So I'm not interested in giving you the title, what it means, and how this works. I'm interested in seeing how you do it, how I tell you to do.
Erin, kind of circling back, thinking about collecting and source material, I wonder if I could also ask you a similar question. So for the more recent colored collages that are in the second gallery of the exhibition, what draws you to those source materials where, I mean, the process of printing is really prominent, and that palette that I mentioned, I wonder if you could just talk about why you're choosing those and what's pulling you.
A lot of those books that I'm using, they're the color collages, or what I think you're talking about, are from books that I collect from the Strand in New York, or I just recently moved to Montreal, and so I've done the tour of all the used bookstores there as well. They're typically published probably 40 years ago or more. And for a while, I was just collecting any sort of anthology of mid-century sculpture, 20th century sculpture. And I just sort of, bought them. They're remaindered books oftentimes, and just flipped through them. Then more recently, I've been more interested in sort of considering the photography, as you say. So not necessarily better resolution and nicer pictures, but I sort of have more attention to how materiality and a sense of a surface is conveyed through the reproduction, on the page. It's not always the best, but I kind of like that. I really like it when they have a sort of mood to them, as they often do. And they do have, I clean up the scans, get rid of all the blemishes on the object, but try to retain that very particular coloration that is so specific to the era of the publication that I think comes through in the final pieces. Creates a little bit of a, they're juxtaposed within the collages, but they create a mood, I think.
Yeah, I mean, they're so far from being pop art, and of course we associate some of those registration dots with somebody like Lichtenstein.
Sure.
But one thing I think less that kind of obvious element, one thing I think they do share a little bit in common with those artists is that interest in the recent past, right? Like none of the pop artists were choosing brand new materials. So for you, I mean, obviously getting into modernist source material is another subject, but just these kind of, they're poppy a little bit, like the palette. Is that something you've been conscious of, pushing against, or embracing with these new works?
It was a great surprise to people at Sigma Jenkins that when I delivered the works to them, because I had a very monochromatic practice up until then. I think Michael was quite pleased. But I had, always come to color through this, through process. Basically, we had included a video in our show together at Albright Knox that was quite colorful, but that was just by virtue of the light reflecting off the surface of the found photograph that I was using for that particular work. So these works are creating opportunities for me to say, well, what color should I use as the backdrop? I'm sure this is the thing when you gave your walkthrough, that beautiful set of works with the pink paper that you had fabricated. I'm so curious to talk to you more about how you arrived at that particular shade, beautiful shade of pink. For me, it causes some anxiety. Like, how do I choose? But it has been very pleasurable to enter into that in my late 40s as an artist, to think about color in a specific way.
There we are.
Yeah.
These are some of the images.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask this later, but I'll ask now since we're talking about it. Arturo, I don't think you're given enough credit as a colorist.
Yeah.
And I would like to say that I think, you absolutely really are. And just what you said, it's like, it's this pink, that red, looking at your work. You have a real skill for, and this might be the theme of this exhibition in some way, is this resistance of synthesis, but this ability to kind of take the fragment and the whole, and you have discordant colors that also create a similar operation, I think. They don't achieve synthesis, but they're absolutely specific. And I wonder if you could talk about your use of color, maybe it could be that pink one, but in one of the works in the show or in a few of them. And I also wondered if you could talk about the art history inspiration that you draw on as it relates to color.
Well, growing up in Venezuela, because I'm from there, the three artists that I was looking at growing up, they were alive when I was there, as Carlos Cruz Diaz and Gego and Alejandro Otero. And Gecko is very monochromatic, but Cruz Diaz and Alejandro Otero were investigating color, and Cruz Diaz took it to a higher level of installation, basically. So I grew up with those works. Then when I moved to the U.S., it was the European art history, modernism, and then when I traveled to Italy, it was the ancient world, and then the Renaissance, and so all of that, it was mixed together onto this. But I believe that color could affect you also how you read the work. And from Matisse, you could learn that shape and color and form is as important as invention or structure or something like that. So I just pay attention to it, and I just pick colors that I like, and thinking about what will be the impact on the architecture when I do wall paintings, or the impact when something is framed. So color is very important, and the materials, luckily, that I've been working with, like felt, is basically pure pigment. It comes in colors, saturated with a pigment. So when you cut it, it's always going to be red inside and outside. MDF also, you could paint it any color you want. And the found materials, I just usually don't alter them. I just respect the way they come. Age, if they're faded or not, all photography or whatever. I like the printing techniques from these old books, and I try to respect that. And when I do interventions of painting on paper, I'm trying to integrate collage and painting as a hybrid, as a contaminated kind of object thing. So color, extremely important, and I think probably from Matisse and from Cruz Diaz and Alejandro Otero. So,
like a really diverse group of artists, actually, to be inspired by in terms of palette. I've looked at your felt works for so long, but I never thought about them in terms of ready-made color. So it's this, like, you could work with pure pigment, which is much more painterly, but in this, it's a similar operation. So really, it's a great way to think about them. Erin, the slides just went by. We're just going to keep going through the images. So those just went by. But you described the video work, which I hope everyone got to see. It's in the last gallery of Erin's exhibition, and you could miss it. So you've got to make sure you keep going around the corner. You surprised me by describing that video, which is an endless tracking shot of this kind of imaginary landscape. And at the same time, it also feels real. It feels concrete. You described it as related to the Vanitas tradition. And this is best known from kind of 17th century Dutch Baroque painting. And everything has a moral. Everything has a story. So there's, someone's blowing bubbles, and it's supposed to remind you that time is fleeting. There's a musical instrument, which is supposed to remind you that all pleasures are fleeting. Every piece of fruit is about to rot. So I thought it was telling that you relate to that particular tradition in a work that is basically this endless tracking shot. So unlike Vanitas, it has this sense of deja vu over and over again, and it literally has no end. It's not about ending exactly. I often think about your work, and as many do, in relationship to the modernist sculptural tradition, which is one that really rejected these sorts of morals and messages and symbolism. And I wondered if this is a work that is a chance to ask you a little bit about your relationship to maybe more historical traditions, if these have played a role in your work. Thinking about how temporal disruption, attention, duration are key subjects to your work, but maybe like, is that some latent interest? Like when you were a kid, were you drawn to these works that had an easy narrative or a story?
Yeah, for sure. And that is a genre that sort of popped up in my work over the years, here and there. I used that sort of composition, a nod to that composition, in a video I made in 2006 that was 8 hours long. I mean, those paintings always attracted me in my 101 art history class in college, for sure. I love that the objects were everyday objects, familiar objects, there on the table that were just what they were, but then had this special sort of code that you did or did not know. I think a formative experience I had as a person, as an artist, was being in a very familiar environment and just having a moment where you sort of become, I used to think of it sort of being unclicked from a regular awareness of the space, of familiarity, and you start to see these things that are so common as these strange objects in front of you. I mean, this might sound pretty flaky, but for me it was, or I was talking to Jeannie actually also the other day when we were walking through specifically about that video. I had a stucco popcorn ceiling in my house, and I would, that's right, popcorn ceiling. And I would lie in bed and sort of my mind would wander, and all of a sudden these images would sort of resolve in the ceiling. So these experiences of sort of dazed, open-ended sort of suspension of time became very meaningful for me, and how objects could be both familiar and very strange, occurrences in your life, how they could be both. And the only thing that separated those was this internal experience that you were having. The videos for me are an opportunity to create that condition potentially for a viewer. So that unending tracking shot, there is no beginning or end to that work. It is a sort of a moment to sit in the space and to have this encounter, in that case, with these very chiaroscuro forms, like sort of slowly like rolling across. They are very unspecific forms for the most part, but then every now and then, just to complicate my life and the life of the viewer, I included a cast of a sort of recognizable form, just to sort of complicate the read a little bit and to sort of maybe snap you into a different kind of attention, because I think it can be a very formal experience, but then it becomes more specific and then kind of becomes more formal. I like that oscillation and attention that can happen. But they do, for me, function like sculptures in the sense that you can go and spend as much time in the space as you want. There isn't, as I say, it's not narrative. When I worked here at SITE, actually, I'm realizing that those videos really had this origin in my experience watching visitors come here to see work. And they would walk through the gallery oftentimes, not sophisticated viewers like you, but they would walk through the space and they would sometimes walk past paintings and sculptures and they would make a beeline for the video. And I always sort of wondered that as this young art student. I was like, why is this? And, I started thinking at that point about the different kinds of attention we bring to art objects, and how the interface of a screen could be quite comforting in this big, unfamiliar environment of an art museum where there's just loads of uncertainty and discomfort. So you can go and you park yourself in front of a screen. And even if you weren't going to sit through the whole thing, there was something graspable about that experience that you could take with you, and that was meaningful. Whereas a sculpture, that's really threatening, because what's there, it's up to you. So I ended up starting making these series of videos sort of from that experience, very perversely videos of sculpture. So the viewer would sit and spend time looking at a sculpture on a screen. That was sort of really the origin of that work for me. This is sort of the latest example of it.
I mean, there is something fascinatingly perverse about those, which is people might breeze right by a work on a pedestal, but you make them sit.
Look at the surfaces.
I couldn't help but catch that there's a vanitas here in Arturo's work.
This is the pandemic
exhibition.
Works, right?
Yeah, this is 2020, 2021. So I painted all these black pieces of wood and worked with illustrations that I had laying around, and I couldn't pay the assistants, so I was working alone for I think a year and a half, and this was around. So there are three elements here, basically the red top and the hands on the bottoms from a Picasso Toreador. You can see that. And then the skull is from El Greco, a detail from El Greco. And then the blue is just a silk screen, one of my drawings made into a silk screen, and then just printed on that. So, the black, I usually don't work with black, but I think it was such difficult time for a lot of people. And this allowed me to kind of concentrate on these very simple images that we didn't know what was going to happen. So I think there's maybe 7 of these in this series But yeah, this is made up with two pieces of paper. So
It's really beautiful. I was struck by it last night. Thank you. I think I have one sort of last question for each of you, which is a little bit about process and new work. So, Arturo, I wonder if, as we go through the pictures, we'll see again the fantastic wall painting on the outside of the building that's here, and that went on view when? No, it wasn't this show, but went on view when? Last year.
Beginning of this year, or something like that.
Could you talk about the process of developing that work for the site?
Well, I mean, I talked to Luis Grachos, and he wanted a new commission for that space, which is the courtyard. And I came here to see the old one, and it's a very difficult architectural space because there are stairs, and it's cut in an extremely difficult, awkward shape. But what I wanted to do is to create some kind of excitement in that space that is very cold. It's painted gray, it's glass, steel, and plaster that is painted gray. So, and the beautiful thing about that is about the wall is that it connects directly with the sky. There are no buildings, there are no trees behind it. So I needed to use blue, but I also needed to create some kind of movement. And that's why I did this combination of organic imagery with very geometric diagonal lines going through this pattern. So it was extremely difficult for the painters to do. They did a fantastic job. It took a week for the planning to do that. But I think in the summer when people use that space, it makes it alive when people are activating that space. For the wall painting in the lobby, it was a different challenge because it's a very severe space and is in the core, at the heart of the institution that welcomes a viewer. And I couldn't do one of my typical wall paintings because it would have overwhelmed the experience of the shows that are coming up. So I decided to connect Carmen, Erin, and myself through very simple color choices, chromatic choices, and a simple line that appears in her work, my work, and Carmen. So I think that's the bridge for those wall paintings. But when I do wall paintings, I have to take in consideration the function of the space and why is it used for and how people use it. And people go directly from reception into the space, but they get a second view, and that's when they hit the whole structure. So.
Right, it's a completely different work in a way. On your way in, you're trying to find the door, you're looking at your watch, where's the coat check, and then on your way out, you're already a different person. Yeah. They're both beautiful works. I love this detail. So Erin, because it's really unmissable, speaking of, I said I was going to talk a lot about magic. I didn't in the end. But your new sculpture, which you've been seeing images of, tell me the title again.
Dusk Form.
Dusk Form, right. It's a little bit of a ship in a bottle in this space. It looks amazing. And I wondered, obviously it's impossible to ignore in the context of your show. I want to ask you a similar question, which is if you could talk a little bit about the process, maybe not of fabrication, but of developing that new work. I think you said you can't remember what source even inspired it, or what flicker of an image inspired it for you.
Yeah, I knew I wanted to make a sculpture for the show, a new sculpture. And I spend so much time looking up books, and I was looking online. I don't know what I was looking at, but however the hours pass when you're sucked into the internet. And I remember this form sort of coming through and it just lodged in my head. And then, I later on that afternoon, I was like, I should look on my internet history, see if I can find that again. And I couldn't for some reason. So, then I stopped trying to find it. And I thought, okay, because the maquette sculptures, the small bronzes in the gray room, are very much a mix of looking at digital collages that I've made and then improvising in my studio and doing line drawings and trying to translate flatness into three-dimensional form. And I decided that it was a good idea to try to concretize sort of a very vague sense of a form from my memory. And so I I started to make a series of maquettes in my studio out of pressboard I just kept on sort of trimming and editing and then it becomes its own thing. It comes out of your head and it becomes a three-dimensional object, as it always is the case in the studio. And then you're like, oh, that doesn't work. And so it was this sort of very slow development. I have many iterations of that object in miniature in my studio in Montreal. And then it came to a point where I was like, all right, I think I can start talking to a fabricator. And I collaborated with a shop that I've worked with before up in Connecticut, and then it became a true collaboration with this artist named Sybren Versteeg, and then it became a collaboration with Max Holmes, the exhibition coordinator here, when he told us the dimensions of the door, and so it went through some editing to make it plausible for highway transport, etc. But it came together really beautifully, exactly sort of as I imagined.
Which never happens.
No.
So
The
in
magic
terms
of Santa Fe.
in terms of scale, though, so did you scale it to the space?
Yes.
Okay, so in your head,
I think the email to Max Holmes, the exhibition coordinator, was, how tall are the ceiling? And I minus 5 inches. And then there was how can we fit it diagonally through the doorway? So those were the considerations. But I did really want something not large just to be large, but I like the idea. Arturo has said a few times that it has this energy of wanting to break out of the space, which I think is interesting. For me, it feels like I like the ship in the bottle image. It feels a bit abandoned and like it's out of place, kind of. Taylor Walsh, who wrote the beautiful text for my show, she said it feels sort of like it's out of place inside, that it should be outside, and I like that sense of it being a bit too big for the space. Sybren mentioned to me as he was fabricating it, because again, I didn't see it until 2 days ago.
So this is the work on the screen.
The big one.
The big thing in the middle.
That thing. Yeah. He said, when you walk around it, it's like a lens distortion, which I loved, of course, because of my interest in photography and sculpture. But I do like how it is very dimensional from one perspective, and then it completely folds in on itself and sort of seems almost digital from another angle. Yeah. And it's it also really connects, I think, to the paper origins. It really does feel still like it's just like a cutout. Arturo, when you're speaking, I tagged along on your tour for the staff, and you talked a lot about how your sculptures, your felt works, are three-dimensional just by virtue of them being hanging on this nail, but they're just flat. And I feel the same way about my work. Even the maquettes, which are three-dimensional objects, they're made out of bent, flat planes always. I feel a real affinity with that in your work. Yeah.
Right, the origins are preserved. What were you going to say?
No, I agree with you.
Okay. I think let me see what time it is. I think it's a fine moment to see if there are questions from the audience. We have a microphone that they'll bring around, so otherwise we'll keep talking. Let me know. Okay, there's one in front.
Hi, thank you for your very insightful questions and enlightening responses. My question is for Arturo, and I'm thinking of the piece The Walk, and how those black spots on the wall are so essentialized and so pared down. I'm thinking of modernism. And then I look at the glass pieces, the kiln glass, and I'm curious to understand how the black glass melted into the clear glass with the beautiful texture of the kiln wash being reflected onto the wall, and then the graphite lines. What drew you to work with glass? It seems such an antithesis to the very opaque felt.
Right. Well, all the work I do has to deal with either collage on paper or canvas, or collage within architecture. Just like the wall paintings are collage temporarily for a specific time. So when you do, like here, for example, the red felt or the hanging felts, they are basically using that space very specifically. they hold the space, they hold the wall, they hold the floor. So it's very important. The placement is not by chance, it's carefully considered to be able to be right. So the glass pieces basically are collaged to the wall. The wall becomes the work, and the pencil line, the graphite line, those pieces are related to dance choreography, or how I would see it. I have talked to some dancers that said, I don't see how I could move that way, or I don't see how the dancers are moving. But for me, when I go to performances, I see it all the way from the top. So I could see the geometry of the dancers and the groups of dancers. So for me, it's a very abstract way of like, oh, these are the lines of the dancers and the groups of dancers, how they're moving through. So it's a very simple technique, fusion glass. It's like a pizza oven, put the black on the clear, and it's done. But to me, I just wanted to glue that on the wall so you could see the transparency and then the opaqueness of the black. Walk in the opposite way, it's a very heavy piece, but the contrast is it was made out of ink drawings, on Japanese paper. So those drawings were made in the opposite way, very solid. But they have this idea of taking you on a journey, and here they take you into the other room. So.
Thank you so much.
So thank you so much to all of you. And I, first of all, wanted to build on what you were saying about the space itself and how perfect the building is. But I also want to give a shout out to the install crew. I think that really enhanced the exhibitions. I also love, I wasn't expecting this, how the two shows play together really nicely. And in particular, how many of the works hover between 2D and 3D and the use of shadow. And so it's maybe more of a remark, but just wanted to know how conscious that was, how shadow plays there, and also how both pieces some of the pieces can swing both ways between 2 and 3 dimensions.
I mean, I think it's my understanding you both developed the shows really separately. So there's, I think, and so much of it came together, like I said, separately, but just through, I think, relationships in their practice that definitely exist, but I think the shows exist so wonderfully as separate experiences that we're lucky to get to see together. I think I agree with you.
I mean, I first saw Arturo's work in 2001 was the hammer wall drawing. I've been a fan of Arturo's for a really long time, and I would never have imagined us having at 2 solo shows that I would be so lucky. And I think the sort of tagline was like, 3 artists invested in abstraction, okay. But it wasn't until going through your walkthrough that I got a deeper understanding of, in fact, the overlaps. Fragmentation, okay, me too. And, the line, the cut, the 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional thing, as you're saying, all of those are very real overlaps. The touchstones are different, perhaps, but the manner and the affect are similar, I think. I'm struck by your large cutouts, how slow you have to be to really get into them. And they're so attenuated and sparse, and yet they're so full as well because of the negative space. The slowness in the work is something that I feel a kinship with too.
Both of you also leave a lot of room for the viewer, which is, I think, one of the great pleasures of both of these shows. Yes. There's a hand in the 4th row here.
This is a question. Don't laugh, Erin. This is a question for Erin. I'm very familiar with your work, and I was surprised. I had a question about the treatment of the pedestals in the gray room. It really surprised me. It was like very unexpected, and I just wanted you to talk about that for a little bit.
For me too. And that's a credit to the install team as well. The thing is, when you're making sculpture, especially sculpture that harkens back to this very sort of modern moment, and that, I'm sorry, sculpture sometimes needs to be on a pedestal, like those things couldn't exist anywhere else, but it's a big problem, pedestals. And I've done, tried to solve that problem in different ways, and then sometimes just defaulted to a white, cube, but I just felt like in that particular, I knew I wanted to have the room be gray and have this sort of very monochromatic moment that would then be juxtaposed with this bright space and this big thing. And so I just floated the idea because I had this very vivid memory of these great floors. And I said, well, what if we did this thing that echoed that? But I was nervous that it was going to be too faux, you know, and I like Kevin and everybody here too much to ask them to cast concrete pedestals. So they assured me.
But you thought about it.
I did.
Yeah.
I did think about it. But he said, I think we can use Quickcrete. And I was like, oh, okay, send me pictures. And the guy actually told me who did it, and they look great. It's actually a set design technique that he used on a Jackie Chan project here in town, which I like. But yeah, you were surprised because you thought I would never do something like that.
It was unexpected.
Yeah.
Because of that, like,
Yeah.
set, like,
Yeah.
a little bit faux.
Yeah.
You could tell that it was like related to the ground, but it isn't.
Yeah. It is.
So yeah, she was just affirming that it was surprising and seemed a
Yes.
little faux. Sorry.
Yeah.
Another question.
This is another question about decisions made by you, Erin, vis-a-vis your installation, and it completely shifted the way I looked at the work. And this is the light shadow on the top of the work in the first room, on the two-dimensional work on the wall. Well, not two-dimensional, the wall
Of the
works.
fold?
Yeah, the light that falls across the fold. And so I was looking at the work. I was able to see it early yesterday before the opening, and I was walking through and looking, and I really got stopped by this shadow that fell across the page, and I found myself then responding to the room in an entirely different way. And so partly my comment and question is that it threw me out of the work a bit to look at the environment. And I think one of the affects of sculpture is that you have to deal with the space, not just the perceived or illusion of space. It was such an interest. I've never seen that before.
That's really interesting experience. I'm glad you articulated that. Did I cut you off, or was that?
No. Well, you just sort of because it just.
Well, it's
changed
something.
a lot in
I
my
guess it relates
interpretation.
to that oscillation I was describing in the video of like being sort of absorbed into the image and then pushed back out. I feel that way for those folded photographs as well, because I think, surfaces can be sexy. You can get into the particularities of those objects, but then the fold asserts itself as a thing in a frame, and so you see it as an object as well. So it's a picture, but an object too. And I think that's what happens, hopefully, in the collage works, the colorful collage works in the other space. They have a dimensionality but they also have an image quality too. Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned the video because I went back to the video again and I looked at it differently. So it was just a very nice, effective use of light, shadow, form throughout the work.
Great.
Thank you. I think we probably have time for one more, if we have one more hand.
Oh, Erin, I just wanted to say I have never experienced black.
It's
as you
really
use
dark,
black.
right? Yeah.
Not only in the big sculpture, which is a magical sculpture. It's 4 or 5 different sculptures when you walk around it. But the blacks on your wall pieces, your flat pieces, I've never seen black like that.
Yeah,
Ever,
they did a
ever,
great
ever.
job.
There's a great lighting designer here.
Sabrina.
Yeah.
Yes.
She's in Venice right now, I heard, right?
Right, she's in Venice working on the...
No, she's incredible. Yeah, she really worked really closely with both of us to set all the right tones in the rooms, right?
I think the crew here is absolutely fantastic. They executed this nightmare wall painting in the lobby, and then they did the one in the reception, plus they did the hanging with multiple changes, and then the lighting. They're just remarkable.
Wait, did you change your installation around a lot?
A little bit, but if you change 20 pieces, that's a lot of work for them.
How
I
many
mean,
works total are in your
I think
show?
70 plus
Yeah.
or something. Yeah.
It's almost the biggest collection of you had a show in Spain that was a little bit bigger. Yeah.
No, it's deceptive. It's because you begin, you think, okay, it's this size of a show, but it unfolds in a really interesting way, and it has everything to do with how you choreographed it with the team here. So I think that's all. Thank you all so much, and really, Erin, Arturo, thank you so much.